Good afternoon, and welcome to the Tutorials and Operations Research presentation titled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Operations Research and Analytics, a research agenda for scholarship, practice, and service. I'm Michael Johnson, Chair of the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'll be sharing my thoughts on this topic with you for the next hour. Though this presentation is pre-recorded, I'll be available to answer questions via chat after the formal presentation is complete. This presentation accompanies a chapter of the same title that is available in this year's volume of essays, 2020 Tutorials in Operations Research, Pushing the Boundaries, Frontiers in Impactful OR/OM Research, co-edited by Cheryl Druhl and Wadad El-Maghrabi. This presentation reflects about 4 years of work on the question, what could our field do better to reflect all of the diversity of our membership, of the larger community of those in operations research and analytics, and the largest community yet of those who might be impacted by our work. Really, for me, it reflects a lifetime of experience from my childhood learning about housing and community development from my mother, to my young adulthood as a student at Morehouse College, a historically Black school, to my career in academia. I hope you'll take away from the presentation a sense of the possibilities for our field if we can enable it to reflect the widest variety of knowledge, experiences, and values of all who are part of this enterprise. In this section, I'll provide a policy and practice context for the presentation and outline the challenge our field faces in addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racial and social justice in our work. The United States has become a more diverse society over the past few decades, and the effects of these demographic changes are well known. A recent study by the Pew Research Center found that a minority of children less than 1 year old were classified as non-Hispanic white. Non-Hispanic whites are forecast to be a majority of the population by 2055. Non-Hispanic whites are, as a group, significantly older than all other population groups combined. Women are a majority of the US population overall and are a majority of more than half of all states and territories and districts. Disparities and inequalities by race, ethnicities, gender, and other measures of identity are ever present in our daily life. Researchers have found that in the US, African Americans and Hispanics have died at disproportionate rates from the COVID-19 virus. And these deaths are due in part to socioeconomic disparities such as housing quality and affordability, transit dependence, reliance on frontline professions, and imbalances in healthcare resources and services. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in quarantines and workplace closures around the world, and these events have had adverse effects on girls and women worldwide. Women are more likely than males to lose jobs in this pandemic, more likely to be victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse, less likely to attend school, and less likely to access contraceptive services. Finally, researchers have found that African American men face a 50% higher lifetime risk of being killed by police than all men, and this rate is about twice that of white men. We know that operations research and analytics provides a wide range of tools to generate knowledge and prescriptions for practice that can balance multiple concerns of efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. However, OR analytics models are only as good as the assumptions that go into them. Therefore, they can have the unintended effect of not addressing and even reinforcing social disparities and inequalities. For example, staff scheduling models can optimize employer profit and flexibility while disadvantaging low-wage workers. Predictive policing models that focus on locations where arrests have occurred can have disparate impacts on the poor and people of color. Smart city applications such as transit information communicated by QR codes can increase scheduling flexibility, yet exclude individuals without smartphones and/or the elderly. Problem structuring and values elicitation for model design often does not engage vulnerable or disenfranchised populations. And finally, place-based healthcare and transit interventions may not account for existing inequalities in local resources or infrastructure. The analytics profession, that is the collection of organizations and institutions at which we learn, teach, and practice OR analytics, often does not accommodate the needs of historically underrepresented groups. By underrepresented groups, I mean persons and communities that have tended not to participate in the practice of OR analytics or receive training in the field or teach in the field as compared to the larger population. For example, women and people of color are underrepresented in OR analytics academic programs and faculty. Women, people of color, LGBTQ persons, and people with disabilities perceive workplace barriers to participation. An educational and professional culture that foregrounds merit, objectivity, and technical excellence can delegitimize concerns with structural barriers and bias. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is often understood as a problem of human resources rather than systems change through analysis, modeling, problem solving, and solutions implementation. So this sounds like a pretty difficult problem. However, the purpose of this presentation and the accompanying piece in this year's Tutorials and Operations Research volume is to argue and present evidence in support of the proposition that our field can make positive contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion. To summarize points I'll develop in more detail later on, innovations in research practice can help us to examine underrepresentation bias in education and work, infuse diversity-related concerns into scholarship and practice, and recognize values and justice as ways to strengthen participation, sense of ownership, and impact. The overall message I want you to take away from this presentation is that where decision modeling recognizes institutional and structural barriers to choice and opportunity and puts voices of disadvantaged groups at the center of its work, OR analytics can enhance equity and support social and racial justice. The goal of this research project, for which today's presentation and accompanying chapter in the Tutorials and Operations Research volume is one important initial effort, is to learn how OR analytics can use diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, to make our discipline and profession more equitable, more just, and more welcoming of people from diverse backgrounds, identities, and communities. To achieve this goal, I will address the following research questions. 1, how diverse and inclusive is the OR analytics profession? 2, what role does diversity, equity, and inclusion play in the discipline? And 3, how can OR analytics research and practice incorporate DEI principles? My hope is that these questions will motivate a research agenda that we can contribute to for a long time to come. In this section, I'll describe the design of the project and provide some key definitions that I will refer to throughout the presentation. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are terms that may be familiar to us, though we may have slightly different understandings of the definitions. These come from the Inform's Diversity and Inclusion Statement, available on the Inform's website, as well as a presentation to the Inform's Board of Directors based on my work with the Inform's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Diversity, we define as the quality of being different or unique at the individual or group level. This includes age, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, language differences, nationality, parental status, physical and mental and developmental abilities, race, religion, sexual orientation, skin color, socioeconomic status, work and behavior styles, the perspectives of each individual shaped by their nation, experiences, and culture, and more. Diversity can also represent variation in measures that are not always visible, such as capabilities and points of view, often referred to as cognitive diversity. Inclusion represents ways to ensure that diversity, sort of a snapshot of the variation in an organization's employees, stakeholders, or clients, is sustainable over the longer term. This can be done by creating an environment in which people feel safe, supported, listened to, and able to do their personal best. Equity denotes the notion that policies, procedures, products, services offered and experienced are seen and understood to be fair both procedurally and substantively. This diagram is a visual representation of this research enterprise. On the upper left-hand side is the notion of the profession, encompassing jobs such as data scientist, demographer, systems engineer, OR analyst, professor, consultant, and many others. On the upper right-hand side is the notion of the discipline, encompassing the many terms used to denote the domains in which we do our work: operations research, management science, industrial engineering, system science, decision science, analytics, and others. Below that is the notion of a lens that describes how we engage or work in the discipline as a solution-oriented practitioner or a scientist focused more on issues of theory and methodology. The arrow connecting the profession and discipline nodes conveys that these terms are interconnected and that each of us is engaged with both, though perhaps at different levels at different times. The word reconsider in the arrow represents that in occupying these roles, we may engage a variety of questions, such as, is DEI separate from research and daily work? Does DEI detract from scientific insight and rigor? Is DEI compatible with good science and engineering? The box on the left-hand side indicates that there are many opportunities to enlarge our concept of the profession through initiatives such as strengthening the pipeline of emerging professionals, educating youth, developing new careers, and introducing new extensions of existing careers. The box on the right-hand side indicates the range of new research questions that may emerge from a new focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The what to do, for example, locate, design, allocate, propose, produce, and plan, and the where to do it, that is healthcare, environment, information systems and information technology, consumer services and marketing, and many other fields. Of course, the box in the middle represents the key terms that motivate our inquiry, which we defined on the previous slide. We leave this conceptual framework with the mission statement for this enterprise: OR analytics for social impact and organizational change. We'll come back to this mission statement later on. The part of this research project focused on the profession is comprised of quantitative analysis of the Inform's membership and qualitative analysis of Inform's organizational context, history, and member experiences. For this presentation, the quantitative analysis will address Inform subdivisions and practitioner-focused initiatives that advance DEI. Of course, I hope to address the other issues on this slide in the future. My work examining the discipline addresses analysis of published work in OR analytics, including peer-reviewed journals, gray literature, books, and dissertations, and a research agenda for DEI in OR analytics. For this presentation, I'll focus on the presence of elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion in published research in which these terms appear to be of primary interest, and a review of research areas and analytic methods that seem particularly useful for engaging notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In this section, I'll present some preliminary results from my examination of the OR analytics profession, focusing primarily on Informs. In 2016, Informs performed a survey of its members to assess satisfaction with many different activities and initiatives. I focus here on one set of questions related to issues of diversity, member and community engagement, and work-life balance. We see from these results that satisfaction levels for all members is not as high as we might like, and these satisfaction levels are particularly low for Informs members who are Black. This is an indication that there may be work to be done to improve the climate of diversity, equity, and inclusion within our society. In 2019, the Informs office shared with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee detailed data on members based on the self-reports we all fill out, or maybe don't, when we initiate or renew our membership. The left-hand panel indicates when prompted to choose a race or ethnicity category that best describes them, many members decline to choose a category, almost half. This large level of non-response is troublesome as it makes it difficult to estimate the actual percentages of members that are white, Black, Hispanic, Latino, and so on. The right-hand panel represents my estimate of the race ethnicity breakdown of Informs members among all respondents who choose a defined category. These imputed values indicate that whites are about 53% of the membership, followed by Asians at 40% of the membership. Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and other groups are each less than 5% of the membership. It should be noted that Informs draws its members from around the world. Thus, these demographic categories may not reflect the self-concept of certain non-Americans. However, Informs does not currently collect data on country of origin of members, so this analysis is necessarily incomplete. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee also received member data on gender. As was the case for race ethnicity on the previous slide, a large fraction of respondents declined to choose a gender category, here about 40%. Again, I've imputed a gender breakdown based on those who chose male or female originally, allowing me to estimate that Informs is about 78% male and 22% female. These numbers may seem lopsided, but we will see later on that they are actually pretty good estimates of the actual gender makeup of the society. In 2017, Aaron Check of University of Michigan and Tom Waidzunas of Temple University conducted an NSF-funded study of a large number of STEM professional societies, including Informs, to learn the role that diversity may play or not play in ensuring participation by all members. Part of this study included a survey of Informs members. As of this presentation, the final findings are not yet public. The Informs part of the study is available on Informs Connect and from the authors. We see that the results of this study reveal gender and race ethnicity breakdowns that are not so different than the results I showed previously using imputations from members' self-reports. For example, the male fraction of Informs population is estimated from the sample to be about 71%. And the white fraction of Informs population is estimated from the sample to be about 61%. In addition, the NSF study collected valuable data on other measures of diversity, as well as member employment. We see, for example, that about half of Informs members are estimated to be employed at a college or university, and about 43% describe their employment field as engineering. The NSF study also included a wide range of questions about workplace experiences to learn about perceptions of bias and discrimination by members of various groups. This slide shows that in response to the question, I feel like I fit in with other people in my workplace, Blacks are statistically significantly less likely than other groups to feel that they fit in, and those with disabilities are statistically significantly less likely than non-disabled people to feel that they fit in. In response to the statement, I have to work harder than my colleagues to be perceived as a legitimate professional, women are statistically significantly more likely to agree with this statement than men. Asians and Blacks are statistically more likely to agree with this statement than respondents from other groups. And those with disabilities are statistically significantly more likely to agree with this statement than those without disabilities. We note that LGBTQ respondents are less likely to agree with this statement than non-LGBTQ respondents. We summarize key findings of the Check and Waidzunas study as follows. First, within Informs, women and racial and ethnic minorities report persistently more negative experiences compared to men and white respondents. Feelings of marginalization and experiences of exclusion are significantly more common among these populations than among white men. Second, disability status of Informs members was a significant factor in a number of the marginalization and devaluation measures. Third, Inform's respondents in university settings reported instances of differential treatment and bias towards disadvantaged groups significantly more frequently than respondents in other employment settings. We continue our analysis of the profession by collecting data on the larger workforce in contrast to Inform's membership with other populations. We find that the STEM workforce, about 6.4% of the total workforce, has a gender makeup that is much more highly male and has lower Black and Hispanic representation and higher Asian representation than the workforce overall. In contrast, the operations research profession, defined by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, is about 131,000 people and is estimated to be majority female and have race ethnicity breakdowns similar to the workforce overall. Finally, the NSF study, which we showed tracks the Inform's membership pretty well, indicates that the society's membership more closely resembles the STEM profession in terms of gender distribution and has even higher representation of Asians and lower representation of Blacks and Hispanics than the STEM workforce, much less the workforce overall. Here we show preliminary results on the demographic makeup of Inform's communities. Our sample data include 2 out of 4 total fora, 6 out of 23 sections, 3 out of 12 societies, and 1 out of 23 US chapters, 5 international chapters, and 39 student chapters. Women, Blacks, and Hispanics are overrepresented in the fora, Women in Operations Research in the Management Sciences and Minority Issues Forum, the first 2 rows of Table 2. The cells that represent overrepresentation are blue. And this is expected for affiliation groups. However, women are consistently overrepresented among other Inform's communities as well, such as the Service Science section and the Manufacturing Service and Operations Management Society. Hispanics are underrepresented, even according to their low presence in Inform's overall, in 6 out of 10 non-fora communities. These are the yellow shaded cells, and overrepresented in only 1. Blacks are underrepresented, again, relative to their low presence in Inform's overall, in 5 out of 10 non-fora communities, and overrepresented in 3. Our findings from an examination of the profession indicate substantial underrepresentation of women, Blacks, and Hispanics, Latinos in Informs as compared to the STEM profession and the US workforce overall, and patterns of underrepresentation by Blacks and Hispanics, Latinos in Inform's communities. Through the NSF study, we find evidence of perceptions of institutional and cultural barriers to acceptance and professional achievement by women, Blacks, Hispanics, Latinos, LGBTQ persons, and those with disabilities. Other professions have engaged the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. In computer science, the theory of computing research community pledge for inclusiveness appeals for a change in attitudes and practice. In economics, disproportionately low participation by traditionally underrepresented groups is understood to hamper the discipline, and this has resulted in responses to broaden participation, change teaching, and remove institutional barriers. In finance, a survey of the literature reveals a lack of diversity in topics and methodological approaches, a bias towards elite institutional sponsorship, and citation-based measures of impact. In urban planning, an awareness of the centrality of discrimination and exclusion in educational and practice has resulted in institutional support for multiple interest groups and recognition of diversity, equity, and inclusion in core educational topics. In this section, we present theory and evidence on the presence of DEI in operations research and analytics. The paper by Saron et al. Titled, "I'm Not a Feminist, but Hegemony of a Meritocratic Ideology and the Limits of Critique Among Women in Engineering," makes a number of what I consider to be important assertions about the engineering field, which, as we have learned, is the academic or professional home for a substantial proportion of our profession. The authors make the case that engineering education builds a worldview in which technical prowess is more important than social skills, that the discipline is pure and objective and distinct from political or cultural concerns, and meritocracy is pretty much unquestioned. As a result, the practice of engineering emphasizes precision and technological innovations over ethics and policy and social impacts. The authors did a field study with female engineering students who filled out diaries, and the field study revealed that the participants understood diversity and inclusion to be a synonym for favoritism, bias, and lower standards. Their concerns about marginalization detracting from the real work to be done. And according to the participants, individual success or failure is seen mostly as the result of one's own efforts, rather than a product, even in part, of institutional and structural values and barriers. It's useful here to recognize distinctions between social sciences and decision sciences regarding ways of knowing and learning, which influence how we understand the utility and impact of our work. I acknowledge that these categories are not fixed in stone. So social sciences' primary goals are to identify causal relationships and evaluate specific initiatives. Decision science, the primary goals are to produce guidelines or policies to deliver products and services that optimize multiple goals, to account for process constraints and limitations, and to view efficiency as primarily a measure of impact or utility. There are some concepts about how our work can be done that are useful to examine. I classify them according to why we do what we do, how we know what we know, how we build and maintain relationships with stakeholders that allow us to do our work, how we do our work, and the nature of the policies, prescriptions, and interventions that we produce. I believe modeling is challenging because there are these many different ways of doing our work. I can classify them broadly as engaged, iterative, inductive, and critical versus managerial, directed, and positivist. This analysis is important to answer these questions. Who are we developing diversity and inclusion focused decision models for and with? And to what purpose will or should these models be put? Community engagement is, I'll argue later, it is important for introducing and supporting notions of diversity, equity, and inclusion in OR analytics. However, it's not always clear what these terms community and engagement mean. By community, I mean residents in a geographical locale or a subcategory of the population with particular needs or requirements that can exist online or on ground in person. By engagement, I refer to notions such as consultation, but not only consultation, preventing co-option, manipulation, and tokenism, and allowing a substantial input into framing both the issues to be discussed and potential actions to address them. For our discussion of DEI, it stands to reason that communities that are of special interest are those that are disadvantaged, underserved, or under-resourced and marginalized. Many skilled public sector practitioners have little training in management, operations, or analytics, so a small bit of our expertise can yield big impacts. And I list some of these here. Systems thinking can emphasize outcomes versus outputs and decision alternatives versus defined tasks. Problem structuring methods can help identify core values, goals, objectives, constraints, attributes, and alternatives. Community-based operations research and community operational research support inductive, mixed methods, and community-engaged problem solving. Social science-based research methods can document social inequities and benefits of diversity and provide evidence in support of decision science-based interventions. But these methods are not commonly taught in US-based OR analytics programs, especially in courses defined as classic OR. We now present a review of published research, much of it from Informs journals, that is based on the work Anahita Khojandi, Pinar Kaskanachek and I did in our 2019 Editor's Cut volume titled Diversity and Inclusion, Analytics for Social Impact. We adapt the categories we developed for that curated collection of papers as follows: workplace diversity, workplace inclusion, diversity and inclusion for development, sustainability, and resiliency, diversity and inclusion in higher education, professional culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion, policy responses to make diversity and equity sustainable, and analytic methods to support DEI research and practice. For the first category, as we show on this slide, we found a range of papers that investigate how diversity works in a wide range of practice settings, including recruiting strategies to increase diversity and effects of identity on work outcomes. For the second category, we learned how organizations make diversity sustainable through policies and practices related to inclusion, including effects of workplace racism on job satisfaction and differential levels of funding for startups based on the race of the entrepreneur. A category of DEI that may be new to some is the notion that DEI-infused interventions can support development of communities, regions, and even countries. We also found multiple examples of interventions in higher education motivated by DEI concerns, such as developing classroom teams and peer feedback among students. Another important category of DEI research addresses how professional culture affects and is influenced by DEI efforts, for example, in career outcomes and competition in the workplace. The next category speaks perhaps most directly to the practical use to which DEI-informed work in OR analytics can be put. Designing new policies, rules, and processes that can transform workplaces, for example, affirmative action programs, and schemes to equalize pay raises among demographic groups. Finally, we address the analytic tools with which DEI-focused interventions can be designed. We distinguish between three approaches: social science-based approaches to establish evidence to justify policy design and practice interventions, prescriptive approaches using primarily quantitative methods to generate new practices and policies where programs are well-defined, and prescriptive approaches using a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods when problems are not so well-defined or when they're controversial or about which not much is known. These approaches are known as community OR, community-based operational research, soft OR, and problem structuring methods. We focus on three papers that illustrate the range of analytic approaches and problem applications that highlight the potential impact of DEI-inspired research. First is the paper, How Costly is Diversity? Affirmative Action in Light of Gender Differences and Competitiveness by Niederle, published in Management Science in 2013. This paper shows how gender gaps in performance and willingness to perform in a competition are reduced under affirmative action, and how payoff maximizing entry decisions result in social benefits that exceed social costs. The second is the paper, Teaching, Decision-Making, and Building Resilience in Youth, a case study to reduce the supply of vulnerable youth to sex traffickers in Atlanta, Georgia, by Taylor in European Journal of Operational Research from 2018. This paper uses decision theoretic techniques to learn how at-risk youth can make better decisions about important life choices. Last is the paper, Biased Perceptions of Racially Diverse Teams and Their Consequences for Research Support, published by Lount in Organization Science in 2015. Here, the paper investigates how perceptions of teams' diversity can influence people's behaviors towards them and evaluations of them. This analysis has yielded a number of promising insights, including the notion that a broad understanding of diversity can help understand whether and how interventions can add value to organizations and the nature of interventions that are potentially Pareto improving. This work has yielded a number of cautionary insights and areas for future work, however. First, diversity, equity, and inclusion is I have observed, primarily a topic of organizational design and management, especially in informed journals. Non-informed journals have a substantial presence in the field, especially journals for a primarily non-US audience. Importantly, there are relatively few examples of DEI-inspired research in the decision science that are performed by members of certain underrepresented groups, rooted in social settings within which communities of color or LGBT persons have a substantial presence, intended to support program and intervention design for services delivery, community development and urban affairs, contexts within which historical and structural discrimination and bias have caused the most harm, and intended to address larger issues of social justice. In this section, we explore a range of ways in which DEI can amplify the impact of OR analytics research and practice, leading with examples of current work. Using Keeney's value-focused thinking, we propose that the fundamental value that guides policy proposals and potential activities related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in OR analytics is to enhance DEI efforts in organizations for positive societal impact, with OR analytics being an important but as yet not fully exploited resource. This statement is important because embracing DEI ought to be seen as more than a mandate or an obligation, but instead as a means to enlarge the social impact of OR analytics and to provide greater opportunities for current and prospective OR analytics scholars, practitioners, and students to contribute to social progress. We believe that a statement like this is essential for providing a clear rationale for DEI-related efforts in OR analytics. This structure, called a means-ends objective network, allows us to connect a fundamental value, like the one at the top of this slide, with a range of alternative potential courses of action. So continuing with this process of VFT, we can identify a range of areas of new work to support this fundamental goal. Some of these are maximize participation across functions and sections of organizations, or support affiliation groups that represent the needs of traditionally underrepresented groups, or develop leadership pathways for members of traditionally underrepresented groups. We strongly encourage readers to consider developing similar statements and frameworks linking potential actions with fundamental values in their own DEI work. We continue our analysis of DEI and OR analytics by presenting a structure that Keeney calls a fundamental values hierarchy, in which fundamental values are linked to a wide range of attributes that can generate specific metrics by which progress towards meeting our fundamental goal of enhancing DEI efforts in organizations for positive social impact can be measured. And these metrics can include, are related to things like marketing or public affairs, or the number of applications and decision modeling or applied social science, scholarly outlets such as books or websites, and so forth. This preliminary values analysis reveals that institutionalizing diversity, equity, and inclusion within OR analytics is much more than diversity plans or outreach or research that is embedded primarily within organization design and management. Instead, it is best understood as a range of ways that diversity, equity, and inclusion can be envisioned as being at the center of all we do as scholars, teachers, professionals, and citizens. This sort of analysis allows OR analytics practitioners and researchers to clarify why they may pursue specific activities that enlarge the presence of DEI in the profession and the discipline. We now present two examples of current research that represent promising applications of DEI-infused thinking in OR analytics. The first is a paper published by Thorson and McGarvey in European Journal of Operational Research in a special issue on community operational research that develops strategies for providing dental services for low-income residents of rural areas. The key insight from this work is that while it can't be the service can't be justified in traditional business terms, that is, revenues exceeding expenses. Providing the service in a way that best balances concerns of equity and efficiency can further the cause of social justice and community impact for a traditionally underrepresented and underserved population. Another promising area of OR analytics motivated by DEI is the issue of new markets designed for marijuana legalization. Jeffrey Moyer's recently completed dissertation investigates the problem of choosing areas that should receive high priority for location of marijuana dispensaries in an environment of legalized marijuana sales and consumption. The figure on the slide indicates that census tracts within the city of Boston, identified as impacted areas, capture more regions adversely affected by marijuana criminalization than those identified by the Cannabis Control Commission. The lightest colored tracts are those identified by the CCC, but not by the new analysis. The tan colored tracts are those identified by both analyses, and the dark colored tracts are those identified by the new analysis alone. Moyer shows that the commission selected tracts in Boston only included about 32% of geo-located drug arrests, while an alternative set of tracts is inclusive of 70% of drug arrests. This work is an example of the ways that DEI-infused research can provide guidance for markets designed for new economies. There are many other promising application areas, including disaster response, workplace scheduling, and services to disadvantaged urban populations. Addressing issues of effectiveness and equity require more than additional competing objectives to be optimized or constraints to define a range of appropriate actions. Instead, researchers and practitioners in OR analytics must increasingly think critically about what problems are worth studying, whose voices may contribute to problem formulation, and how our model's recommendations will further the immediate goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the longer-term goals of social and racial justice. Within NFORMS, there are a number of promising initiatives to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Pro Bono Analytics Initiative connects analytics professionals with mission-driven, resource-constrained, and community-serving nonprofit organizations that seek to solve difficult problems, some quantitative in nature, such as analysis of services or warehouse stocking policies, and others more qualitative in nature, such as seeking to understand how young students who receive educational enrichment related to disability issues can change their perceptions of disabled people. The Doing Good with Good OR student competition for the past decade has highlighted outstanding student research on public service applications of OR analytics. Project Mindset represents an effort led by NFORMS member Ken Chelst and funded by the National Science Foundation to provide exposure to OR analytics at all levels of K-12 education, in part to enlarge the pipeline of traditionally underrepresented groups within the profession and the discipline. For the past few years, the Manufacturing and Service Operations Management Society has presented a Responsible Research Award. Since 2016, NFORMS has supported the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Susan Martinosi, a distinguished NFORMS member at Harvard-Mudd College, is the current chair. The DEI committee has its origins as a subdivisions council subcommittee in 2015 and an ad hoc board committee in 2016 before transitioning to standing committee status. It's inspired by offices of diversity and inclusion in many agencies and organizations and initiatives at peer professional societies such as the American Economic Association, Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning, the American Mathematical Society, and many others. The DEI committee produced a statement on diversity and inclusion, which I have shown on this slide, that NFORMS subsequently adopted. A project of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee is the Diversity Community on NFORMS Connect, which encourages conversation, networking, access to best practices, research, and community building for Informs members from a wide range of backgrounds. The Informs Board of Directors, led by Pinar Keskinacek, seeks to nurture a wide range of initiatives by Informs members to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion within the society and in the broader community. Examples of current projects under the Informs Diversity Ambassador Program include Building an Empowered Community for Women in Color in ORMS, led by Julie Ivey, Maria Mayorga, and Karen Hinklen. Bringing STEM education to underserved communities, led by Aida Ramatalabi, Caroline Margaret Johnson, and Phoebe Villanos, and an exploration of editorial board diversity, led by Margaret Brando. We previously mentioned a 2019 initiative in the Informs Editor's Cut series titled Diversity and Inclusion, Analytics for Social Impact. This curated collection of published research, much of it in Informs journals, was the basis for the literature review presented earlier. We hope it will provide inspiration and resources for all who wish to enter or expand this exciting research and practice space. Earlier this year, the journal Management Science produced an online special issue devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It features papers published in Management Science from 2016 to the present on a wide range of topics, many of which have been included in the literature review that we presented earlier in this talk. There are many other DEI-related innovations that we'd like to highlight. The Kapoor Foundation has engaged in many activities to address the leaky tech pipeline. One of these is recognizing the multiple and reinforcing barriers to participation by underrepresented groups in high-tech and STEM fields associated with bias in hiring, pay inequality, bias and advancement opportunities, and many other factors. Another initiative is to describe initiatives to better understand the demographics of the tech workforce and provide funding opportunities to tech entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds. In addition, there are a number of organizations that seek to change the culture of localized interventions to support community engagement, resources to support university community engagements, and ways to investigate our own biases, for example, Harvard University's Project Implicit, as well as suggestions for ways to learn about the work of large, experienced, mission-based nonprofits like the YMCA or ACLU, and social movements such as the Movement for Black Lives. In this section, we review what we've learned from this preliminary study of diversity, equity, and inclusion in OR analytics, and provide some ideas and suggestions for ways to enlarge the impact of this work. There are a number of takeaways we'd like to emphasize. The engineering profession presents substantial barriers to engaging diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core concern. Informs, as a representative of the OR analytics profession, faces substantial challenges in meeting the needs of traditionally underrepresented groups. The research literature related to DEI is disproportionately represented in particular social science affiliated subfields, with relatively few examples of research intended to reflect and meet the needs of communities of color and other marginalized groups. There are multiple promising initiatives that can build capacity for DEI-infused research, teaching, and service with an explicit goal of social and racial equity and justice. There are lots of ways for all of us to contribute to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion in OR analytics. These include, but aren't limited to, making diversity, equity, and inclusion part of our mission statements, our individual and organizational mission statements. Identify and address norms and values that marginalize underrepresented groups. Broaden the range of social problems that could be addressed by the tools and methods at our disposal. Support collaborations across disciplinary and methodological boundaries. Put underrepresented communities at the center of knowledge production and increase engagement with communities and community-based organizations. Here we provide specific examples of ways that each of us can work to make our profession and our discipline more welcoming to and supportive of traditionally underrepresented groups. These examples are inspired by the notion that we are more than our degrees, our areas of research, our employers. We bring to our work and to our community work, into our personal lives, identities that are important to name, to recognize, and to value. We also believe that bias, discrimination, oppression, and the trauma associated with these are real for many of us, and we must recognize them and work to address them. Where can we go from here? I believe that we have a great opportunity to develop new conceptions of the profession and the discipline in which concepts of DEI are central. For example, the New York Times 1619 Project provides a critical, historical approach to motivate research questions that embrace history and social policy, as well as engineering and applied social science. For example, is it possible that the roots of our profession come not only from the Industrial Revolution, but from the records and management practices of those who enslaved African Americans? Can we really do research in transportation planning and community development without understanding the role that segregation and redlining have played in producing our country that is so profoundly divided by race, ethnicity, and class? Transdisciplinary approaches allow research to be performed in which participants represent different disciplinary methodological traditions. For example, OR analytics and community planning and urban planning and community development, sociology, economics, and other social sciences and humanities, as well as long recognized collaborations with researchers in healthcare, energy, environment, and many other areas. Community engaged OR, or the synthesis of community OR, best known outside the US, and community-based OR, can support research in, with, and for community members and community representing organizations with the explicit goal of organizational change, learning and advocacy, and social impact. Finally, the movement for Black Lives, amplified by the worldwide protests in support of racial justice over these past months, along with the work of scholar Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, can inspire us to ask how our teaching, research, and practice can be fundamentally transformed by a recognition of the pervasive nature of anti-Black racism and racist history and practices that affected so many different communities. This presentation would not have been possible without the work and inspiration of so many people. Informs past President Brian Denton, and Informs past President Mark Daskin, Informs current President Pinar Keskenocek, Informs fellow John Calkins, Informs Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Chair and Vice Chair Susan Martinosi and Anahita Kojandi, Julie Ivey and Mark Lewis, past chairs of the Informs Minority Issues Forum, Amy Smith, Associate Professor in the Department of Public Policy and Public Affairs at University of Massachusetts, my Tutorials in OR co-author and longtime collaborator in this space, George Kikiro of University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the really valuable research assistants of UMass Boston doctoral students, Liz James and Maria Manuela Pache de Atiade. Thank you so much for your attention to this presentation. I hope you found it as inspiring and thought-provoking as I have in entering this research space. There's so much more to do, and I look forward to questions, suggestions, and even ideas for collaborations. I hope we'll have lots to talk about in the chat after the presentation. These pictures represent, to me, what is special about diversity for the work I do and the place I live. I provide here a list of resources that may be of use to those who want to learn from the very best that our peer societies, institutions, and professions have to offer in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Here are some of the many sources I've cited in this presentation. I encourage you to check out the Tutorials and Operations Research chapter that is the basis for this presentation for a complete set of references. And here are some more references. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to view this presentation. I hope you found it enlightening and thought-provoking. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the virtual chat that follows, or through conversations in the many ways that we now interact virtually. Have a great rest of conference, and don't forget to download the tutorials in Operations Research 2020 volume. Thank you very much.